Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, so for tonight, you and I were talking about like what kind of show we wanted to do, what kind of topics we wanted to get into, and just having kind of a conversation about whether modern purity culture is driven by, well-meaning fools, people that like sincerely believe, even if they've been misled, or more by like disingenuous political operators. And you told me a story about family ties to a church speaking out of both sides of their mouth, and I just really needed you to share that with the audience.
Right. So, my answer to jump ahead, I think it's both, but I would like to
Sure.
share a
Yeah.
story. So my own family, I come from an evangelical, charismatic, some would say just Pentecostal, but charismatic kind of background, and I have a lot of extended family that are still a part of that. And about a year ago, I had a family member of mine who works at a church. He's one of the leaders at that church, and he uh, had broadcasted to the family that they were doing this event where they were going to have a weekend long event to kind of commemorate and show honor, or maybe show appreciation for the Indigenous peoples of Canada, because we do have like this day of National Truth and Reconciliation Day, where we kind of take time to think about what happened in the residential schools and that sort of thing. And so I was really, actually, first I was kind of impressed. I was like, wow, they're going to have an actual event at the church to talk about this. And so I tuned in because everything's online right now.
Mm.
I had tuned in, and I had watched a couple of the events that they had at that weekend and the sermons. And I was, first of all, kind of impressed the fact that they had, really spoken about the history of what actually happened and the harm that was done. And, just the wiping out of this entire culture. And there was some very sincere apologies and grief that were being expressed. And then they ended it with this idea that the only thing that could bring true healing to these people is Jesus. And
Mm.
that the people who are still engaged with their ancient practices and their rituals are involved in witchcraft. And I almost threw my computer on the floor. I was so mad. I was so upset that they took this opportunity to, maybe actually have some reconciliation and an opportunity for like true apology for what had happened to the Indigenous people in Canada when the church had come in and basically tried to wipe out their culture. But then they chose to end it with this idea that it's still witchcraft. And I and I just thought, like, wow, that is out of both sides of your mouth. That is two things. It's acknowledging the harm and then basically reiterating why they did the harm.
Right. No, exactly. Just this notion that we are oh so sorry for those things that we did when we tried to eradicate your culture. Good thing we're here to now
Yeah.
eradicate your culture. And
Yeah.
just the disconnect there is so baffling to me. I mean, I kind of already heard you say that it's both, but I am just struggling with how people can so actively and intentionally push this like Christian nationalist mindset and culture, but then rationalize the harm as negligible or inevitable, or maybe even for our own good. I mean, how do we wrap our head around that?
Like, so I said that I think it's both. I know in my own experience growing up in that kind of very similar environment, the fear was real. They like the indoctrination for the people who are in the pew. I think there is a very genuinely held belief in these things like spiritual warfare, demons, witchcraft, Satan worship, not just,
Hmm.
Satan, but like actually worshiping the devil and performing these horrible acts as part of their ritual. The belief was so real. I think that there is a level of like that's the harm that they see. They see the
Hmm.
harm being of, this being involved in idolatry and witchcraft as being the most severe harm that's being done on this earth. And so they will look at something else going on, as in like the persecution of these other cultures or the demonization of anything that's non-Christian, as being a very, a rational reason to cause another type of
Totally
harm.
valid. Yeah.
Right. And like I said, I think it's both, because I think that as you go higher up in maybe like the church hierarchy, I do think that when you get into the, the higher levels of authority, and when you start talking about politics and that sort of thing, I think it does shift to more of this political lens, and that we can use this to try to kind of push our agenda with the, trying to have the supremacy over the culture. But as far as the everyday churchgoer, I don't think that they even realize that's what's going on. I think they're a pawn in this whole thing, and
Yeah.
I
I mean, I don't
tough.
think of myself as a skeptical person. I mean, certainly I'm here doing this, but as a general rule, I believe people when they talk, in the sense that, like, I sincerely believe that most people believe most of the things that they say. And yet I see, some of the politicians here in Texas, demonizing trans children, for example. And I struggle so much with the notion that this has anything to do with a sincerely held belief. And then on this show, we've actually had the opportunity to speak to journalists and to speak to kind of other experts who have interacted directly with these folks, who often say it very much seems to be sincerely held. And that is difficult for me to wrap my mind around.
Yeah. It is really hard to it's hard to believe it. It's hard to believe that these are truly held, very genuinely held beliefs by these people. But it is, honestly, a lot of times it is this incredible amount of fear that is put in to this group of people. I grew up in it. I held those fears for a long time
Sure.
myself. I believed that there was, things that you could do, it's associations with certain types of people, even, that you could do that would genuinely invite the devil to mess with your life or mess with your health or things like that. So, I try really hard to hold on to that memory of how scared I was,
Yeah. No, I
because
hear that. As
yeah.
a therapist, I spoke recently to somebody about their experiences as a child, sincerely believing that if they didn't witness to and then rescue their friends as a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old, their friends were going to go to hell, and it was their fault. And I was talking about this with my mom, and she was kind of sharing her own fears and her own experiences with how awful that is and how scary all of that is. And then later on in the conversation, she was still like, but, thank God for Christ. And I, I believe in her sincerity, but it is challenging to hold both of those things at the same time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have these memories of going back, as like, there was a demonization, and I don't think they would, like, call it demonization, but there was this
Sure. Well, it's
they were
not proper demons. It's the
right,
the good
proper
Lord.
demons. I'm talking more in, like, the way that we talk about how kind of character assassinate a
Hmm.
person or a group of people. There was almost like a tier list, right? Like, there people okay, first of all, other people who are Christians, other denominations. I was Pentecostal, so the Baptist, or uh,
Hmm.
Mennonite, or anything Catholicism,
Yeah,
like
Catholics were at the bottom
Catholics were
layer of
bottom
Christians,
of the
and
Christian tier.
oftentimes didn't make the cut in terms of who we understood
Oh,
was going
yeah.
to heaven.
Yeah, and then below that, you get, the very big variations of Christianity. You get Mormonism or
Oh,
Jehovah's
right. Yeah.
Witness, and then on the way past that, you get other religions that are not related to Christianity specifically. So there was, like, this fear mechanism built in. The farther you got away from what I believed or what we believed, the more dangerous you were, and the more fear was stoked in that. And I remember that being really hard for me as a kid too. I recognize that same, or like, I relate to that story that you just said about the stress that you have, as a young child growing up in that, and feeling like you have this duty to rescue everybody, but at the same time be afraid of them if they
Yeah.
don't believe the same as you. So, um, yeah, it's it's stressful, and it can be really damaging for even someone's social development as they're growing up, being, putting people in different categories,
Sure.
and structuring your life in a way that, like, these are safe people and these are not safe people. And, you're told to love everybody, but you're actually also supposed to be afraid of them, which makes it
Hmm.
very hard to truly, express true care for people.
Yeah, to be in the world but not of it, and to be
Yeah.
like trying to connect with people but always with this agenda. I mean, it
Yeah.
creates such a friction in any like healthy human relationship, which I guess is what we're here to talk about tonight.
Hmm.
I want to be really mindful about some of the big historical and significant stuff that we're talking about. I don't want to equate like purity rings to genocide,
Right.
but I know that obviously purity culture is a lot more than that. Is it at all fair to look at modern, like true love waits, I kiss dating goodbye, moral majority type purity culture in contrast to things like the Catholic mission system and residential schooling and like early modern witch hunts?
Yeah, I agree. I want to be really mindful of not making these glib comparisons between purity culture and these, or like a harmful ideology and like the willful attempt to annihilate an entire culture. I think what we want to do today is just take a look kind of at the background ideas that are going on here and to kind of find some comparisons and
Mm.
to look at some of the kind of underlying ideas that kind of drive some of these things and see where they're the same and why how they are still happening.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so what are some of the motivations here? I mean, I know that we keep coming back to this idea that there is going to be sort of a mixture of different types of folks, that there are going to be some people who really are sincere, dedicated believers, and that by and large, maybe the rank and file is in that category, even if there are some maybe like manipulative masterminds at the top of the political pyramid. But there's still so much harm that's being caused here. I mean, what can we say about the motives for some of those like historical campaigns and genocides?
Right. So if we go back a little bit farther, we look at these different campaigns to um, kind of attack an entire group of people at one time. Um, I found it very interesting that there was this this modern equation of these other religious beliefs or even just cultural beliefs and comparing it to witchcraft. I think there's a lot of history here with the witchcraft kind of accusations, and so I think that one of the comparisons that we can make is that there is um, this kind of supremacy kind of underlying thinking in it, and that if you look at Christian culture and you look at how they have constantly kind of looked at other cultures or even people who just stood outside the lines of what was their ideal kind of person,
Mm,
whether it was man or woman, if you stood outside of that patriarchal kind of ideal, there was a demonization of you. And I think we can look at the history of like the witch accusations and the witch burnings and the thousands and thousands of people that were killed in that era, as just this kind of drive for like purity and then also misogyny, like this villainization of women in
mhm.
general, and even others. There was more people than just women that were accused of being witches in the Middle Ages specifically. But um, there's always this kind of looking at people who are on the outliers of society and fearing them and causing this huge divide, this us versus them, and finding a way to get rid of them. Honestly, it's like this idea of that if you don't fall within the lines of our ideal, then we need to be rid of you. And one way that we can make that happen is to make everybody who falls underneath the hierarchy afraid of you. Um, so I think that's where you get into that kind of dichotomy of like whether it's like a lunatic. What did you say? The people who truly believe and people who are just striving for power. I think a lot of people who are in power will often use these ideas to fear the outsider as a way to like indoctrinate people and to cause them to become fearful of anyone that's outside of your ideal. um, and yeah, and then we get the people who are in the lower ranks of whatever hierarchy it is, and they really do have these fears about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, the church in many ways has lost a lot of power historically, and we, in some ways, live in a much less violent society. And yet we see that same sort of like demonizing tactic to motivate voters, for instance. I mean, I think we can look very clearly at the way trans people are being talked about in the
Right.
news, are being, frankly, talked about in the comment sections of shows like this one, and recognize that there's that same instinct to kind of demonize and, gain political power by having a villain to come after here. Is it at all fair to compare that to the notion of witch burning and some of these other like historical activities?
I think it is like there is a similarity in there, and it's just this idea of control and power.
Hmm.
And the easiest people to control are people who conform. And so whether we going back to like the witch burning days, or if we're looking at modern society and people who are in the queer community, one thing that's similar is that they're not falling in line. They're not falling in line with
Mm,
the
sure.
ideal. And so anybody who kind of steps, I mean, anybody who steps outside of the ideal is going to be it's going to be harder to control them. So whether it is somebody from the Middle Ages who's a woman who's kind of independent and rebellious or whatever, and they're going to call you a witch and they're going to burn you, or whether it is somebody who falls outside of this ideal family values, things of the moral majority, they're going to find a way to demonize you. And maybe we don't have witch burning campaigns, but we have other kind of campaigns going on right now, and it is this campaigns to kind of the mindset of people. They want to convince people to hate these other individuals who are unlike you. There is a similarity there. It's different. It's enacted differently now, but it is the same kind of fear mongering, us versus them, and then ultimately how do we obtain power and control, as it's always been.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I wonder about the mindset, the philosophy of a, historical priest who is like torturing or executing somebody while truly believing that they're doing God's work. And then, I honestly like will talk to people who call into this show, a minority of folks who call into the show, but who very clearly don't seem to understand the issue that they're so angry about.
Right.
And I feel like I can almost kind of get it. I mean, is there anything that you can say about the cognitive dissonance that comes from believing that you are filled with perfect love while also being called to drive out sinfulness at all costs?
Um, I think when I think about that is just like I think a lot of what we see right now, whether it is the homeschooling or the church, the way the church is set up right now, and it's just this idea to kind of insulate the community and to very aggressively indoctrinate people to become fearful of these individuals. And I mean, we see a lot of it online. It's very back and forth. It's very hateful.
Mm,
I think that one thing that we maybe kind of lose sight of is real life interactions. And I mean, that's been harder over the last couple of years. I know for myself, I had a lot of these fears growing up. I didn't even realize they were fears. I thought they were just part of it was just the way things were. Like,
sure.
I am a Christ follower and I have these beliefs, and I know that these people who are stepping outside of that ideal are they're wrong. And not only that, the farther you go down on that tier list, they are evil. And so I need to be careful of them, but at the same time, witness to them. But I think when you get into the real world, the cognitive dissonance comes when you meet people. I think that's
Mm,
one of the
mhm.
biggest and best ways for someone to kind of challenge their belief system, is to meet somebody who falls inside of that or falls outside of that ideal, because you're really challenged to see them as a human being. Um, I think that's why a lot of like the apologetics will like kind of caution against going to post-secondary education, and like
Oh,
kind of
sure.
caution away from this, because they realize that people meeting other people is the best way that these ideas are broken down. When you meet somebody who's, for myself, meeting people who are a part of the queer community, meeting people who are part of the indigenous community, um, just anybody who I had this innate fear over, it's almost impossible to continue that. I mean, I will say almost, because we're going to talk about that later. for myself, I met these people and it was immediately caught up with this cognitive dissonance of that it wasn't the way that I was taught that I was taught. I
Hmm.
was invited to, partake in some other kind of cultural things, and it was like the best experience that I've ever had. It was beautiful and there was nothing scary about it. So a lot of the fears that I had been instilled with were completely unjust. Like they
Sure.
absolutely. And that challenged me to think about like why was I taught to fear it when there's no harm that came to me by being around it. So it had to be something deeper. It had to be a concept that was being taught to me on a more meta level.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, meeting a actual human being, like
Yeah.
interacting with a queer in the wild, is a powerful force. But I think this is another piece of why media representation is so important,
Yes.
and why there is such a active and aggressive desire to censor media. I mean, particularly growing up in a very purity culture type of household, there were meaning like huge restrictions on what we could watch and what we could participate in.
Mhm.
And honestly, my plans to be a Christian counselor were absolutely dashed as soon as I had access to like any form of queer media. So I think that there's a lot to that idea, and I definitely want to talk more about the the way that we need to all just coexist, and what it means to try and form a society when we have so many folks determined to, at all costs drive out that sin.